There comes a moment in every painful connection with an avoidant where something shifts. Not in them first, in you. And that shift changes everything. Because for so long you chased answers. You chased clarity. You chased affection. You chased signs that they cared. You overanalyzed delayed texts. You replayed conversations in your head at 2 a.m. You wondered why someone who once seemed interested suddenly became cold, distant, hard to reach, emotionally unavailable. And slowly, without pushy, realizing it, your entire emotional world started revolving around someone who kept pulling away. But then something happens. One day you get tired, not angry, not dramatic, just tired. Tired of carrying the relationship emotionally. Tired of begging for consistency. Tired of feeling anxious every time they disappear. Tired of shrinking yourself just to keep someone comfortable. And this is the moment that changes the game. Because avoidants are often most comfortable when they feel emotionally pushy, in control of the distance. But when you truly stop caring, when your energy genuinely leaves, when you stop chasing, stop checking, stop reacting, that's when the final strange trick appears. Suddenly, they notice you. Not because they suddenly transformed overnight, but because your absence finally became real. See, many avoidants don't fully process emotional loss while they still feel they have access to you. As long as you're waiting, hoping, emotionally available, part of them assumes the pushy connection still exists, even in silence, even after pulling away, even after hurting you. But healing changes your energy, and people feel that. They feel when you stop trying to convince them to love you. They feel when your attention is no longer trapped inside their confusion. And the moment they sense they are losing emotional access to you, many avoidants begin doing something strange. They reach out indirectly, a random text, a sudden compliment, a memory from the past, a social media, pushy, reaction after weeks of silence, a hey, just checking on you. And for a second, your heart starts racing again. Because the person who ignored your feelings suddenly seems emotionally awake. But listen carefully. This is where most people lose all the healing they fought so hard for. Because attention is not always transformation. Missing access to you is not always the same as being ready to love you properly. And this truth hurts. Sometimes avoidants return when they feel safe again, not pushy, because they're finally prepared to give you the consistency you deserved all along. Sometimes they simply miss the emotional comfort of knowing you were there. That's the final trick. Not always manipulation in an evil sense. Sometimes it's unconscious. Sometimes they genuinely feel confused themselves. But confusion can still break your heart if you mistake it for commitment. And this is why emotionally strong people learn one powerful lesson. Do not let temporary attention make you forget. Pushy. Permanent patterns. If someone needed to lose you before valuing you, you must ask yourself a difficult question. Why did your pain not matter until your absence did? That question changes everything. Because real love does not constantly require emotional starvation before appreciation appears. Real love communicates. Real love reassures. Real love does not leave you carrying the entire emotional burden alone. Now here's the deeper truth most people never understand. The moment you stop chasing, pushy, and avoidant, you finally meet yourself again. You remember your worth. You remember your standards. You remember your peace. You remember who you were before anxiety became your personality. And suddenly, their mixed signals no longer control your nervous system. That is freedom, not getting them back. Freedom is no longer abandoning yourself just to keep someone emotionally close. And ironically, that grounded energy is often what makes avoidants notice you the most. Because emotionally, pushy, detached people are deeply impacted by emotional shifts they cannot control. When your attention disappears, they feel it. When your validation disappears, they feel it. When your emotional availability disappears, they feel it. But your job is not to turn their fear into your responsibility again. Your job is to protect the peace you almost destroyed yourself trying to earn love from the wrong place. So if an avoidant suddenly returns after you stop caring, don't panic. Don't romanticize it. Pushy, instantly. Don't assume every breadcrumb is a breakthrough. Watch actions. Watch consistency. Watch emotional maturity. Because healed people stop falling in love with potential. They pay attention to patterns. And maybe the hardest part of all this is realizing the version of you who desperately wanted them back no longer exists. You outgrew that version through pain. You survived nights they never saw. You rebuilt confidence they helped destroy. You learned that closure is not always pushy, something another person gives you. Sometimes closure is finally seen clearly, and clarity changes everything. So if they come back with that final strange trick, that sudden warmth, that confusing attention, pause before giving your heart away again. Because the real victory was never making the avoidant chase you. The real victory was becoming someone who no longer needs to chase anyone to feel worthy of love. Most people think avoidants react when you argue, cry, beg, or demand answers. Pushy. But that is not usually the moment they feel the deepest emotional impact. The strongest reaction often comes later, when your emotional energy finally disappears. When you stop chasing, stop over-explaining, stop trying to prove your value, something shifts inside the dynamic. And that shift can deeply affect an avoidant in ways they rarely admit openly. For a long time, many avoidants become accustomed to emotional pursuit, even if they complain about pressure or closeness, part of them quietly. Pushy grows used to knowing you are still there. They expect the long paragraphs. They expect the emotional check-ins. They expect you to return after every cold moment, every confusing silence, every withdrawal. Your consistency becomes their emotional safety net, even while they struggle to provide that same consistency back to you. That is why your detachment can feel so shocking to them. At first, they may not notice it immediately. Avoidants are experts at distracting themselves. They bury, pushy, emotions under work, routines, entertainment, independence, or emotional distance. But eventually, they begin to sense the difference. Your reactions become quieter. Your availability changes. The emotional intensity they once relied on slowly disappears, and suddenly the connection no longer feels guaranteed. That is when the anxiety often begins inside them. Not always dramatic anxiety. Sometimes it is subtle. A strange curiosity. A sudden urge to check your social media. A random memory, pushy, appearing in their mind late at night. A feeling they cannot fully explain. Because when someone who once emotionally chased them becomes calm and emotionally self-contained, the avoidant loses the emotional control they unconsciously depended on. And this is important to understand. Many avoidants are not emotionally activated by closeness alone. They are emotionally activated by emotional distance they cannot control. As long as they believed you would always be there, they could continue. Pushy, avoiding deeper vulnerability. But when your energy genuinely leaves, reality hits differently. The emotional bond suddenly feels fragile instead of permanent. And for the first time, they may start confronting emotions they spent months suppressing. This is why some avoidants suddenly return right when you begin healing. Not because your pain moved them when you were begging for love, but because your emotional absence finally became real enough to feel. Human beings often notice value most, pushy, intensely when access disappears. And avoidants are no exception. But this creates a dangerous emotional trap for the person who was hurt. Because when an avoidant suddenly reaches out after silence, it can feel like validation. It can feel like proof that they cared all along. And yes, maybe part of them did care deeply. But caring and emotional readiness are not always the same thing. Missing your presence does not automatically mean they are prepared to love you differently. That is why, pushy, emotionally strong people learn to pay attention not only to emotional reactions, but to emotional patterns. Anyone can feel fear when they lose access to someone. But lasting change requires self-awareness, vulnerability, accountability, and consistent effort over time. One of the most confusing things about avoidance is that their final trick rarely looks obvious. It is usually subtle, quiet, and emotionally calculated in ways that leave you questioning everything. They often do not come, pushy, back with dramatic confessions or grand apologies. Instead, they return through small emotional openings that seem harmless on the surface but carry emotional weight underneath. A random message saying, "Hey, I was thinking about you." A sudden reaction to your story after weeks of silence. A memory they bring up out of nowhere. A soft compliment. A casual question that feels deeper than it sounds. And because you spent so long craving emotional reassurance from them, even the smallest attention, pushy, can feel incredibly powerful. That is the strange part. The same person who once made you feel invisible suddenly gives you tiny pieces of warmth, and your heart immediately wants to believe something has changed. But this is where emotional confusion begins. Avoidants often struggle with direct vulnerability. Deep emotional conversations can feel overwhelming to them because vulnerability activates fear, pressure, or loss of control. So instead of openly saying, "I miss you deeply" or "I'm pushy," afraid of losing you, they test emotional access indirectly. They send signals instead of clarity. They drop breadcrumbs instead of intentions. And those breadcrumbs are designed to measure one thing. Do they still have emotional access to you? That is why the attention can feel so inconsistent. One moment they seem emotionally interested, almost affectionate. The next moment they pull back again, become cold again, or disappear again. It leaves you trapped in emotional whiplash because you, pushy, keep trying to decode what their behavior truly means. But many times, the behavior is not about commitment. It is about reassurance. Reassurance that you still care. Reassurance that the emotional door is still open. reassurance that they have not fully lost you. This does not always come from manipulation in a cruel sense. Sometimes it comes from emotional fear they do not even understand themselves. Avoidants often experience conflicting emotions at the same time. They crave connection, but pushy, fear dependence. They miss intimacy but feel overwhelmed when it becomes real. They want closeness, but panic when vulnerability requires consistency. So when they feel your energy pulling away, they may instinctively try to reconnect just enough to reduce their discomfort. Not necessarily enough to build a healthy relationship, but enough to restore emotional familiarity. And this is why so many people get trapped in cycles with avoidance for years. Because intermittent attention is pushy, emotionally addictive. Small moments of warmth after long periods of distance create powerful emotional highs. You start surviving on crumbs because the inconsistency makes every tiny sign of affection feel rare and valuable. But emotionally healthy love does not keep you starving for reassurance. Emotionally healthy love does not make you analyze every message like it is a hidden puzzle. Real connection creates clarity, not constant confusion. That is why you must learn to separate emotional, pushy, attention from emotional intention. Someone reaching out does not automatically mean they are ready to show up differently. Someone missing you does not automatically mean they are capable of sustaining intimacy in a healthy way. And if you are not careful, you can mistake temporary emotional curiosity for genuine emotional growth. One of the strangest and most painful experiences with avoidance is watching them suddenly become warm, curious, or emotional after they spent months acting distant, pushy. The timing feels almost cruel. When you were trying to connect, they seemed emotionally unavailable. When you were asking for reassurance, they pulled away. When you wanted clarity, they became silent. But the moment you begin healing, detaching, and focusing on yourself, they suddenly start showing signs of emotional life again. And for many people, this creates enormous confusion because the avoidant who once ignored your emotional needs now starts acting interested again. They ask questions, pushy, about your life. They notice changes in you. They become softer in their tone. Sometimes they even open up emotionally in ways they never did before. It can feel like you are finally getting the version of them you always hoped existed. But the deeper truth is that emotional distance often protects avoidants from confronting loss in real time. While you were emotionally available, part of them unconsciously believed the connection was still secure, even if communication slowed down. Even if they, pushy, withdrew emotionally, they still felt your presence waiting in the background. Your emotional attachment gave them a sense of safety without requiring full vulnerability from them. But once your energy changes, something changes inside them too. When they notice you are no longer chasing, no longer reacting emotionally, no longer trying to force connection, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty activates emotions they were previously avoiding. Suddenly, they are forced to face the possibility, pushy, that you may truly move on emotionally. That realization can hit avoidance much later than it hits other people. This is why some avoidants seem emotionally delayed. They may suppress emotions during the relationship, only to feel everything intensely after distance becomes real. The emotional processing they avoided for months finally begins catching up to them. Memories become stronger, regret becomes heavier, curiosity increases, and they begin reaching toward you in small emotional ways. Pushy. Sometimes they become surprisingly attentive. They may suddenly remember little details about you. They may mention inside jokes, old conversations, or emotional moments they once acted unaffected by. They may appear more emotionally vulnerable than ever before. And because this warmth feels so different from the coldness you experienced before, it becomes easy to believe they have completely changed. But emotional warmth is not always emotional readiness. That is the painful part many people, pushy, struggle to accept. An avoidant can genuinely miss you and still not be capable of sustaining a healthy relationship. They can feel emotional longing while still fearing true intimacy. They can temporarily open up emotionally without having developed the consistency required for long-term connection. And this is where people often abandon their healing. Because after spending so much time feeling emotionally rejected, even temporary affection can feel deeply validating. Your heart wants to, pushy, believe the pain finally meant something. You want to believe they finally understand your value. You want to believe the story is changing. But emotionally mature people learn to look beyond temporary emotion and focus on long-term behavior. Anyone can become emotional when they feel loss. Anyone can become warm when they fear disconnection. But lasting love is not built on temporary emotional waves. It is built on consistency, emotional safety, communication, accountability, and the pushy willingness to stay emotionally present even when things become uncomfortable. One of the hardest truths to accept about avoidance is this: Sometimes when they come back, they are not returning because they are finally ready for commitment. Sometimes they are returning because they miss the emotional reassurance you gave them. And if you do not understand this difference, you can easily mistake emotional longing for genuine transformation. This is what hurts so many people emotionally, because pushy. When an avoidant suddenly reaches out after distance, your heart naturally wants to believe the relationship is finally becoming real. After all the silence, confusion, and emotional inconsistency, their attention feels meaningful. It feels like they finally see your value. And in some ways, maybe they do. But recognizing your value is not the same thing as being capable of building a healthy emotional connection with you. Many avoidants deeply enjoy emotional comfort without fully understanding. Pushy. The responsibility that comes with emotional intimacy. They enjoy knowing someone cares deeply about them. They enjoy feeling emotionally wanted. They enjoy the safety of knowing someone is emotionally attached, patient, understanding, and available. That emotional reassurance becomes comforting to them, especially during moments of loneliness, stress, insecurity, or emotional emptiness. But commitment requires more than emotional comfort. Commitment requires consistency when emotions become pushy, difficult. Commitment requires communication during conflict instead of withdrawal. Commitment requires emotional accountability instead of silence. And this is often where avoidants struggle the most. So when they feel your emotional energy disappearing, they may suddenly feel unsettled. The comfort they quietly relied on begins slipping away. The emotional access they once took for granted no longer feels guaranteed. And because human beings naturally react to emotional loss, they may begin pushy, reaching back toward you. Not always because they are fully ready to love differently. Sometimes because they miss how you made them feel. There is a painful difference between someone loving your presence and someone being emotionally prepared to protect your heart. And many people learn this lesson too late. They reopen the emotional door the moment the avoidant shows attention again. They assume the sudden affection means the avoidant has changed internally. They interpret emotional curiosity, pushy, as emotional growth. But after the emotional intensity settles down, the old patterns slowly return. The inconsistency returns. The emotional distance returns. The confusion returns. Why? Because temporary fear of losing you created emotional urgency. But emotional urgency is not the same thing as deep personal transformation. Real transformation takes self-awareness. It takes uncomfortable inner work. It takes the ability to recognize harmful patterns and consciously change them over time. Pushy. Without that deeper work, the relationship often falls back into the same painful cycle, no matter how emotional the reunion feels at first. And this creates one of the most emotionally exhausting experiences a person can go through. You keep hoping each return means something permanent. You keep believing this version of them is finally different. But hope without behavioral change slowly destroys emotional peace. This is why emotionally mature people stop focusing only on feelings and start pushy, focusing on consistency. Anyone can feel emotional when they are afraid of losing someone. Anyone can become temporarily affectionate when access is disappearing. But healthy love is measured by stability, reliability, emotional safety, and long-term effort. Because at the end of the day, someone missing your energy does not automatically mean they are ready to stop hurting your heart. One of the deepest reasons avoidants react strongly when you stop caring is because you're healing quietly. Pushy removes the emotional control their distance once had over you. And whether they realize it consciously or not, that shift changes the entire dynamic between you. For a long time, your emotional energy may have revolved around them. Their text affected your mood. Their silence created anxiety. Their attention gave you temporary relief. You waited for signs, analyzed mixed signals, replayed conversations, and searched for emotional clarity from someone who rarely gave it consistently. Without pushy realizing it, you slowly handed them emotional influence over your peace. And avoidants often become comfortable inside that imbalance. Not necessarily because they are cruel people, but because emotional distance allows them to feel safer and more in control. As long as you remained emotionally invested, chasing answers, seeking reassurance, and emotionally available despite the inconsistency, part of them unconsciously felt secure knowing the connection still existed on their terms. But, pushy, healing changes your energy in a powerful way. When you begin emotionally detaching, something becomes different about you. You stop reacting the same way. You stop needing immediate validation. You stop trying to force emotional closeness from someone who keeps resisting it. Your attention slowly returns to yourself instead of constantly orbiting around their behavior. And that shift can deeply unsettle avoidants. Because your healing removes the emotional certainty they once relied on. Pushy. Suddenly they cannot predict you anymore. Suddenly your silence feels different. Suddenly, the emotional control their distance once created begins disappearing. This is why avoidants often seem most emotionally activated when you genuinely begin moving forward. They notice when your energy becomes calmer. They notice when desperation disappears from your communication. They notice when you stop emotionally chasing them. And for the first time, they may feel what you spent months feeling. Pushy, uncertainty. That uncertainty can become emotionally uncomfortable for them because avoidants are often more emotionally affected by losing emotional access than by maintaining emotional closeness. While they may resist intimacy directly, they still notice when someone emotionally disconnects from them for real. And the painful irony is that your healing often makes you more attractive to them than your emotional pursuit ever did. Why? Because emotional independence removes pressure, while also pushy, creating emotional distance they cannot control. The version of you who constantly chased them felt emotionally available no matter how inconsistent they became. But the healed version of you feels emotionally grounded, self-protective, and harder to emotionally predict. That changes the power dynamic completely. But this is where many people make a critical mistake. The moment the avoidant starts reacting again, they abandon their healing journey to regain the emotional connection they once pushy, craved. They confuse the avoidant's renewed attention with proof that the relationship is finally becoming healthy. And slowly they slide back into the same emotional cycle they worked so hard to escape. But true healing means recognizing something important. Your peace became stronger the moment you stopped allowing someone else's inconsistency to control your emotional state. That is real power, not making the avoidant anxious, not making them jealous, not making them chase you. Real power is pushy, becoming emotionally stable enough that another person's mixed signals no longer determine your self-worth, your confidence, or your ability to feel okay. And when you reach that level emotionally, the dynamic changes forever because you are no longer operating from fear of losing someone who was never fully choosing you consistently in the first place. The greatest victory in any painful connection with an avoidant is not making them come back. It is not making them jealous. It is not finally pushy, hearing them admit they miss you. The greatest victory is becoming emotionally grounded enough that you no longer get pulled back into the same cycle that once broke your peace. Because for many people, the hardest addiction is not the person themselves. It is the hope. The hope that this time will be different. The hope that the avoidant finally understands your value. The hope that the pain, confusion, and emotional waiting will eventually turn into the love you imagined from the beginning. Pushy. And hope can keep people emotionally trapped for years. Every small sign of attention feels meaningful. Every text feels like progress. Every emotional moment feels like proof that the relationship is changing. But emotionally grounded people learn something powerful. Consistency matters more than temporary emotion. Anyone can become emotional when they fear losing access to someone. Anyone can suddenly act warm when they feel your energy disappearing. But emotionally mature love is not measured, pushy, by emotional highs during moments of loss. It is measured by daily behavior, emotional safety, communication, reliability, and effort over time. This is why healing requires emotional discipline. Because when an avoidance suddenly reappears, it can trigger all your old emotions at once. The anxiety returns, the attachment returns, the fantasy returns. Part of you wants to believe this is finally the breakthrough you waited for. But emotionally grounded people pause before reacting emotionally. Pushy. They observe. They pay attention to patterns instead of promises. They notice whether the avoidant is truly showing consistent emotional growth or simply reacting temporarily to the fear of losing emotional access. And this shift changes everything. Before healing, you may have chased emotional crumbs because your self-worth became connected to their attention. Their approval felt like validation. Their affection felt like relief. Their distance felt like rejection. Your emotional stability, pushy, dependent on what they gave or withheld. But grounding yourself emotionally means reclaiming that power. It means realizing your peace cannot depend on someone else's inconsistency anymore. It means understanding that love should not constantly leave you anxious, confused, emotionally exhausted, or afraid of abandonment. Healthy love may have challenges, but it does not force you to constantly earn basic emotional reassurance. And when you truly internalize this, something incredible happens. You, pushy, stop romanticizing emotional unavailability. You stop chasing people who only value you when they feel you slipping away. You stop abandoning your own emotional needs just to maintain connection. That is real healing. Not becoming cold, not becoming bitter, not pretending you never cared. Real healing is being able to care about someone without losing yourself inside them. And that level of emotional grounding is powerful because it breaks the cycle that once controlled you. The avoidant may, pushy, still reach out. They may still test emotional access. They may still become curious about you again. But now, instead of reacting from loneliness, fear, or desperation, you respond from clarity. You no longer confuse attention with commitment. You no longer mistake emotional intensity for emotional maturity. You no longer ignore painful patterns just because someone suddenly misses you. And perhaps the most important transformation of all is this. You stop seeing their return as the prize, pushy, because your peace became the prize. Your confidence became the prize. Your emotional stability became the prize. And once you reach that level internally, you stop needing another person to choose you before you finally choose yourself. In the end, one of the most painful truths about avoidance is that they often react the strongest not when you are fighting for them, but when you finally stop emotionally chasing them. The moment you begin reclaiming your peace, rebuilding your confidence, and pushy, emotionally detaching from the constant cycle of confusion, something shifts inside the dynamic. Suddenly, the person who once seemed distant becomes curious again. The person who ignored your emotional needs starts showing signs of warmth. And for a moment, it feels like everything you hoped for is finally happening. But this journey teaches a deeper lesson about human behavior, emotional patterns, and self-worth. It teaches you that someone noticing your absence is not always the same as pushy. Someone becoming emotionally ready to love you in the healthy, consistent way you deserved all along. So many people lose themselves trying to earn love from emotionally unavailable people. They overgive, over-explain, overthink, and over-sacrifice, hoping that enough patience will eventually create emotional security. But relationships cannot survive on potential alone. Love cannot grow properly where communication is inconsistent. Vulnerability is avoided, and emotional responsibility is pushy, constantly delayed. The hardest part is that avoidants may genuinely care in their own way. They may miss you deeply. They may feel emotional pain after losing you. But feelings alone are not enough to build a stable connection. Real love requires emotional maturity, accountability, consistency, and the willingness to stay emotionally present even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Without those things, the cycle simply repeats itself no matter how emotional the reunion feels in the pushy beginning. That is why healing changes your entire perspective. You stop focusing only on what someone feels for you and start paying attention to how they consistently treat you. You begin understanding that emotional breadcrumbs are not the same as commitment. You realize that temporary affection after distance does not erase long periods of confusion, inconsistency, or emotional neglect. And slowly, you stop measuring your worth by another person's ability to choose you. This is where pushy, emotional freedom begins. Not when the avoidant finally returns, apologizes, or gives you attention again, but when their behavior no longer controls your emotional state. The moment you can see their actions clearly without abandoning yourself emotionally is the moment you truly begin healing. There is also a powerful irony in all of this. The more emotionally grounded you become, the more attractive your energy often becomes to avoidance. When desperation disappears, when emotional dependence, pushy, fades, when your life no longer revolves around waiting for someone to validate your existence, your energy changes completely. You become calmer, stronger, more self-respecting, and emotionally harder to manipulate through inconsistency. But the goal of healing is not to make the avoidant chase you. The goal is to become someone who no longer needs to chase anyone to feel worthy, valuable, or lovable. Because once your peace becomes stronger than your fear of losing someone, you stop settling. Pushy. For emotional instability disguised as love. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden inside all this pain. Sometimes the relationship was never meant to teach you how to keep the avoidant. Sometimes it was meant to teach you how to stop losing yourself. It was meant to show you the cost of abandoning your emotional needs for temporary connection. It was meant to teach you boundaries, self-respect, emotional awareness, and the difference between love and emotional addiction. And when you finally understand that, everything changes. You stop begging for clarity from people committed to confusion. You stop chasing validation from emotionally distant hearts. You stop romanticizing inconsistency. And for the first time in a long time, you begin choosing yourself with the same loyalty, patience, and emotional energy you once gave to someone else. Thank you so much for spending your time here today. If this message spoke to your heart, remember this. You are never asking for too much. Pushy. Love, too much reassurance, or too much consistency. You are simply asking the wrong person to give you what they were not emotionally ready to provide. And no matter how painful this journey has been, do not let it convince you that your heart is hard to love. The right connection will never make you feel like you must lose yourself just to keep someone close. If you are healing from an avoidant connection right now, give yourself credit for every step forward, even the small ones. Healing is pushy, not about pretending you never cared. It is about learning how to care about yourself just as deeply as you cared about someone else. And the moment you stop chasing emotional validation from distant people, you'll find that your self-worth is not defined by their opinions. You begin creating space for healthier love, stronger boundaries, and real emotional peace to enter your life. Thank you again for listening, for reflecting,